Welcome to Nature Calls, Conversations from the Hudson Valley. Our team's goal is to present science-based information about gardening and all things nature in New York's Hudson Valley. Hosts Jean and Tim, along with team members Teresa and Linda, are master gardener volunteers for New York's Columbia and Greene counties. So if you're interested in gardening or nature or nuggets of information about what's happening outside your door, settle in. Enjoy the conversation. Whatever the season, we have something to say.
I am Tim Kennelty.
And I'm Jean Thomas.
And welcome to Nature Calls, Conversations from the Hudson Valley.
Our conversation today is with Brianna Davis and Eli Joseph Hunter, owners of Green Bee Greenhouse Limited in Cornwallville, New York. Green Bee is a non-certified organic nursery specializing in growing vegetable seedlings and perennials. Aside from hundreds of vegetable varieties and perennials, they also offer a huge rotating list of trees, shrubs, and fruits.
Green Bee is an amazing place. If you haven't gone, you really need to go check it out. And today I think we're going to have a really interesting conversation. We're going to talk about native plants, nativars, non-natives, and kind of how you select those. And Eli and Brianna, you plant all three of those types of plants, right?
Thanks for having us again, firstly.
Happy to be here.
We grow all sorts of plants. Part of our mission is to grow as many things as our climate can responsibly support. And that responsibility is where this conversation, I think, will get honed in. What does that mean? And is there room for introductions in that?
And what do you think the percentage in your nursery of natives versus non-natives? And let's talk a little bit about that and why you're growing them and the demand for both.
That's a good question. I think because we love plants, we have a huge array of native plants, more than most, and people think of us because of that. But we also have a large array of introduced plants. I bet it's at least 50-50, if not more.
We've started growing more and more native plants, both the straight species forms and cultivars of native plants over the last, I'd say, 5 years, because our interest has grown that way and also because people are more interested than they used to be. And if we take away the percentage of vegetables and herbs and annuals that we grow, which are almost none of those are native, basically.
Right.
Yeah, I think 50-50 sounds
certainly
possible.
Reasonable, yeah.
I mean, going back right to the beginning, how do you choose what's in your nursery? How do you choose your inventory of what you're growing, period, and selling?
A lot of it has to do with what we are excited about growing in our own gardens.
Isn't
Definitely.
that great?
Yes.
Yeah, because I think that's unique, right? I think.
I can only speak from my own experience, but certainly being avid gardeners and collectors governs the way we approach horticulture. We've talked about how we're looking to develop our land into an arboretum, and so when we're building the inventory, we think, what is in the landscape? What do we need in our landscape? What are we excited about showing people? What can we show people with the context of decades behind it?
And also, what do we see a lot of success with in gardens, both on our own property and also for people that we plant gardens for? What do we see in terms of succession planting and planting for local birds and insects and wildlife? How do we kind of meld all of those things? And that helps us decide what we're going to carry in our nursery.
So my devious little mind kicks in here. How much do you overstock so you have some leftovers?
That's like the selfish mind, I think.
That's what I would do.
Yeah.
Actually, a lot of what we plant in our own gardens is usually what's left over, and what we haven't sold at the end of the season. And we have these frenzies in the fall when we have a little bit more time, and we put a lot of plants into our own garden.
I noticed we haven't been invited to the frenzies, have we? Maybe that needs to happen, I think.
Yeah, I used to be invited to frenzies, but
we're too old for frenzies, I think. I mean, one thing we should state at the very beginning, too, is you don't sell anything that's on the invasive list.
That's
right?
correct.
That's a rule.
From the very beginning of our
Because we still
business.
see privet and things like that sold at big box stores, so there's nothing like that.
No.
And we even have decided not to grow things that are on the invasive list that we don't see as invasive in this area. For example, Miscanthus sinensis is one of my favorite grasses, but we do not grow or sell that anymore because it's on the invasive list,
And
unfortunately.
yeah, and it will be.
And once you have it, you can never get rid of it because it's so hard to dig up, right?
Well, yeah, but that's a separate matter. Actually, that's sometimes people, and we can get more into this, like the messiness with the terminology. Some people think of a difficult plant to dig up as invasive,
right,
which isn't the definition necessarily, or they think of a hardy plant as native, and that's not necessarily the definition. And part of our role is to educate people about the difference between what might be a thug or what might just be a really aggressive root system versus something that spreads unchecked and has a negative impact on the existing indigenous ecology.
So educate us then. Educate us.
There are native bad guys, is what you're saying.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think that it's not black and white is what I'm saying. There are native plants that have the capacity to spread so aggressively that they create monocultures, which is not what we want. And there are introduced plants that don't spread at all and offer benefit to the whole food web. When people talk about native, a good definition would be plants that have evolved within the ecosystem that they're in, and an introduced plant is one that is brought over. But then there's naturalization, which is when an introduced plant has harmoniously established itself within the original ecology.
But if somebody walks into your nursery and they say, is this a native plant? I assume if it's not native to Greene County, but it's native to the Northeast, you're considering it a native, right?
Yes, and sometimes we'll specify. We'll say, well, this has a native range from the southern part of our state to as far south as Florida, but we're still considering it native.
But if it's a western, like Amelanchier, you're not calling that
No, like
native.
western arborvitae, we wouldn't
Right.
consider native to us. That's too big a gap.
Right.
But we could tell people that it's native to
Colorado,
North America,
right.
or
And
wherever
that
we are. Yeah.
and it's a suitable plant to put in your landscape. It
Right.
has usefulness and it's not harmful.
So a lot of the prairie plants, because they're in
Right.
the same
Right.
zone, are perfectly fine, even though they're not native to Greene County.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, I think of coneflowers as really native, but I don't think they're native to Columbia County and Greene County, but they're great, I would say, native plants because they're native to North America and they have all these benefits, right? So I consider them natives and I plant them all the time.
It really comes down to what you individually are considering native, because there are some, we've worked on projects that I know you've talked to Mark Wolf at Mountaintop Arboretum, and that project that we worked on with them was so specifically native just to the mountaintop. And then you can have a broader sense of what nativity means. You can define it however way you want to.
Right.
Everything's native somewhere.
Right.
Well, that's like it's 5 o'clock everywhere or someplace, right? Which is really a justification for drinking, is what you're talking about, right?
Pretty much.
Yeah, I mean, and planting anything.
So you can plant whatever you want while drinking. Is that what you're saying?
That's pretty much. It all looks good.
And I mean, some people are purists. I don't fall into this category where they're really looking at ecotypes, right? Which is really something that's native specifically to the area you're in, correct?
Yeah.
Just definitionally.
I think when people come to us, and because these definitions aren't always so clearly defined, the overarching principle we're trying to put out there is that we want people to love plants. Mm-hmm. And we want them to be good stewards of the land. And getting them to think about the health of their ecosystem and its biodiversity and what that will do to all the interconnected species that we all depend on, that everyone depends on everyone else. And having them embrace a wide palette of plants with that thought in mind will create responsible and devoted gardeners, which is, the more of those the world has, the better.
So you're also preaching the gospel. You really are. Now you're educating people who come wandering in and want a burning bush and explaining to them why that's probably not a good idea and so on and so on. But I mean, it's a huge education undertaking.
Well, when someone comes in looking for a burning bush because they don't know that that's a harmful species, the first thing is you don't want to discourage their impetus to plant a plant.
Or alienate anyone.
Right. And so it's just so you know, we don't sell that because it's an invasive species. Actually, legally, we're not even supposed to. But more importantly, it's a harmful plant. Here's why. But there's a myriad of other choices that may satisfy your desire for that plant. Well, you want something for red fall color, maybe you want a blueberry. If you want something for that sort of architecture, maybe, some specific viburnum might check that box. We talked about this last time I was on. We played the version of 20 questions of what they're looking to fulfill in their landscape and then try to help them pick something that will satisfy their aesthetic needs but also be a benefit to their environment.
I think that's why I was there so long the last time I was there, because we did many 20 questions.
It explains a lot.
Yeah. So let's talk about native cultivars or nativars. Tell us about how you feel about that. And I assume you sell some. I know I plant some. Tell us. And it's not one size fits all, right? Some of them are better than others.
Yeah, we found that sometimes the species form is often stronger, but we do trial and grow out a lot of cultivars of native plants that we really love and enjoy and are native, right?
And non-native also. I mean,
sorry, I didn't hear you.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So give us an example. Like I always think of coneflowers. I mean, I keep going back to them. Like some of them are beautiful, the yellow and orange. I just don't find them. Not only I don't know about their pollen nectar, but they're not necessarily as hardy, right?
Yeah, some don't have the staying power in the garden. Well, first of all, cultivar is cultivated variety, and people should understand that. That means that humans are taking a species of plant and making selections for some quality. And so frequently those selections are made simply for aesthetics. So you have a mutation of plant X that's got a yellow leaf instead of a green, and then people propagate that vegetatively in order to make lots of clones of that plant and put something new into our palate. So sometimes a cultivar will become less useful for pollinators or wildlife. I'll use a hydrangea arborescens as an example. Hydrangea arborescens is one of our native hydrangeas, and the standard bearer for it is a variety called Annabelle. And Annabelle has, most of you are probably familiar with it, it's like a huge mop head, a white sterile floret composed of all these little sterile sepals, or I forget the morphology. But it's selected from what was originally more of a lace-cappy fertile flower, and it's very showy. Great plant, looks great in the landscape, has a really long-lasting bloom, really good aesthetically, not so good for pollinators. The development of that plant then led us to a pink version, of which there are many named varieties of these pink sterile hydrangea arborescens, and now finally they've turned full corner or full circle and given us pink fertile forms. Things like pinky pollen ring.
I love pinky pollen ring.
It's a great plant.
Yeah, it is a great plant.
And, here's a plant that has all of the adaptability of the original species form, but has given us this pink color that the original species did not have. So it's very, very showy in the garden, but it's also good for pollinators. So human selection can have pros and cons, and sometimes both. And sometimes it can go through a less useful period and come back to something more functional.
But it does seem like the breeders, and maybe I'm just being optimistic here, are not just thinking about aesthetics, but now they're starting to think about pollinators because people are demanding that, right?
Absolutely.
Do you think that's really happening?
Yeah, I think so. I think that there's a lot of development for the consumer that is being more mindful about climate change and their role in ecology. Like the breeders are paying attention to that. Some of it's a little cynical. It's like the branding piece where people are like, well, here's a market share we're missing. But at the same time, if that's putting out more good plants and more benefits for the environment, I think that's worth having.
Well, anything that tones down the variegated everything on the planet would be good.
I just want to go back to, I know you had mentioned the coneflowers, and we kind of skipped over that, but I remember when we first started doing this, all of a sudden there were all these new colors. There was red and yellow and everything in between, and the doubles and everything. And that seems like it has not slowed down, but that the cultivars have shifted, and some of the weaker ones have kind of been weeded out. And before it was only really Echinacea angustifolia primarily, and now we're starting to see cultivars of Echinacea pallida or pallida, which is one of our favorites and is, I believe, native to mostly Tennessee, I think.
I think that's right.
It's beautiful. It's very strong in some gardens in the right context. It self-sows. The pollinators are all over it all the time. It's incredible. And now we're starting to see some of the breeders develop that, which is really nice.
So it's got like hardy genes in it. Is that? Oh, that's interesting. Interesting. I mean, the double-flowered ones generally are less useful as pollen plants. Is that correct in your
Agree. We
experience?
Don't grow that many of them. Sometimes we do. We used to grow one called tangerine or...
There's been a bunch, and a lot of them really didn't last very long, so we've sort of phased them out. And I don't know from any sort of scientific perspective if logically they wouldn't be as good nectar plants, but I have observed some of them being incredibly fragrant, and I've certainly seen plenty of insects visit some of them, so anecdotally, I'm not sure. Just because something is mostly sterile doesn't mean it doesn't have any use.
One of the strongest cultivars that we've seen with the Echinacea angustifolia is called green twister, or now it's changing to emerald twister, and now it's changing to something else. But they're kind of continuously breeding that one, and pollinators love it. Ours are always covered in insects, and butterflies and hummingbirds visit them, and they're really beautiful.
I'm making a note.
Wait, what are your other favorites out? Because we're now plant-aholicking out here.
Yeah.
What are your other favorite cultivars of coneflower that you sell and like?
Well, the Echinacea pallida that I mentioned before, it has very long, drooping, pale pink petals. That one is really enjoyed by pollinators.
Hula Dancer is a nice variety.
Hula Dancer is a cultivar of that, which has even strappier petals. We also last year started growing Echinacea angustifolia, and I found one cultivar of that this year that we're going to try. And then we really both just enjoyed the aesthetics of the green ones. There's the emerald twister that I spoke of already, and then one called Green Jewel, which is a more compact, very neat looking plant. You can plant 20 of them and they all stay the same height, but the pollinators seem to really enjoy them despite their strong cultivation.
Brianna, you know more about this group than I do, but the impression I have, and this is true about a number of different groups, is that there's also a lot of, in that R&D, there's a lot of back crossing, so there's hybridization from a lot of species. And I suspect, and this gets back into the question, sometimes, that hybrid vigor may be a net gain for all the pollinators, and sometimes it might be a loss for those that are specialists, right? And some of that I think might be worth just kind of paying attention to in the garden, trying them all out and observing who's on which and seeing which species of insects love which crosses of Echinacea or any other type of plant.
Okay, my little butterfly brain just came up with another plant. Hellebores.
Oh,
Yeah.
Recently, the hellebores have become less bashful. The flowers, instead of drooping and being like a secret, you have to know to look for the flowers and where they are. Now, all of a sudden, they're all going up. I saw a picture of a mass of them at a plant show recently. They were just crazy. Are you getting into those?
Yeah, I have not committed them to memory quite yet which ones are being bred for the upright flowers, but we have noticed certainly over the last bunch of years that there are more and more, and we are carrying them. We just ordered, I think, 10 different varieties of hellebore. And we like to keep the tried and true that we know well, and then also try some new ones each year so we can observe them and see if they are strong and which way their flowers go. This goes for all.
And do they
plants, really.
seem to be as attractive to the birds and the bees and the butterflies?
I haven't noticed that quite yet.
When they
They're
fly?
very early.
Very early.
The bees is a great moment to go back into the overarching conversation here, where people often think of the honeybee as this most iconic pollinator that we're all trying to cultivate for. And I just want to remind all the listeners, there's an example of a non-native naturalized insect that we all love and depend on. And so when we are planting gardens for the bees' early cleansing flight forage, having pussy willows or witch hazels or things that are flowering incredibly early for the bees, sometimes it's matching the right plant for the right pollinator, and neither of those in this case are native species, or not always. For the witch hazel, there's Hamamelis vernalis, which is native, but there's all these intermedias, which are from Asian progeny. And that's, again, it's not a harmful plant. It's got a usefulness. The bees are certainly not harmful. And so there's an important part of our ecosystem, and our presence in it, and reminding us that we mostly are not native people also cultivating this land that we've taken over.
Now, with the Hamamelis, they're a totally different time frame, the native from the introduced as well.
Well, no, so
that-
the Virginiana is a native fall flowering one.
Yeah.
And Vernalis is a very, very late winter, early spring one, which often overlaps with their intermedias.
Yeah.
And then there's hybridization there's one called Winter Champagne, which is a cross between Virginiana and Vernalis, which flowers in December, January, which is not useful for any pollinator, but it's beautiful to have
Yeah, who
in our
cares?
landscape.
And especially when you need some flowers in
It's
December,
pretty.
right?
It's true, but
beautiful.
there's some native plant that is not adding anything besides something for our spirit.
Food for the soul.
So let me ask you about leaf color, because you mentioned variegation, and I agree with you, Jean. I used to be a variegation lunatic in my garden, but I do have a couple of different cultivars of redbud that I just think are insanely beautiful. And I know there's been some research on leaf color and whether it's then, if you're really breeding out the benefits for host species. But you sell some of these cultivars that have different leaf colors, correct?
Yeah. I don't know the answer as far as whether they have equal benefit or any benefit. A lot of the native species have more understated beauty and attributes.
Right.
And to occasionally punctuate that in an ornamental landscape with something a little more over the top has a usefulness. And so if you have a very small landscape and you only have space for a few plants, certainly it would be more impactful to make sure that you are putting beneficials in that landscape. If you have space for big swaths of things, then absolutely, like having a forest pansy redbud with its purple leaf and pink flower is a beautiful, beautiful plant, especially if you can also at your woodland edge have some straight Cercis canadensis or even the alba to be available for the insects and wildlife that require those.
See, this is like a therapy session because...
No, it's not. I'm drooling all over
They're
the
massaging my guilt because I do have a straight species, but then I have this one and I can't remember the cultivar, and it's like maroon and lime green, and it's called like...
Oh, Sweetheart. Is it
it's some
Carolina Sweetheart, maybe?
No, it's some weird name, but it's like everybody who walks into my garden, especially non-plant people, say, what is that?
Yeah.
And usually they point at the things that are non-native, but in this case they're pointing to a cultivar. But yeah, I mean, I think you're... And it has flowers, so it's definitely a pollinator plant as well.
Yeah. I mean, so redbuds are a great example. We're collectors. So we have, in our collection, we of course have just the straight species redbuds, but we also have selections for weeping forms. It used to just be covey or lavender twist, which is a green-leafed, pink-flowered weeping redbud, but now there's chartreuse-leafed and red-leafed weeping forms with white and pink flowers. There's variegated ones with white, variegation, and the one that you described. There's chartreuse selections. There's the rising sun, which has an ombre effect.
That's it.
Rising
The
sun's
rising
a
sun.
great plant.
Right. Yeah.
It's glorious, and some of these plants you can put in more sun, and the color is more enhanced, and you can put them in more shade if they're adaptable and it's subdued, and you can start to like really create a whole range of genus or species and really observe it across all of the different characteristics.
So I just saw a lecture by Doug Tallamy. We were talking about this before we got on, where he talked about someone who had written to him and said, I'm planting all these natives, but my wife loves ginkgos, so I planted a ginkgo. And he said, that's fine. And, there's something to that too, right? I mean, that if you want a particular species, as long as it isn't super invasive, it's an opportunity cost because you might plant an oak there instead, but it's something that if you want to have that in your garden, that's just fine.
Absolutely.
And one of my current favorite resource right now is the book that Doug Tallamy and Rick Darker wrote together. Mm-hmm. And we've really been referencing that a lot. And that's where a lot of our philosophy is.
Is it a shade book? I'm trying to...
No, I think it's called The Living Landscape.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he talks about ginkgo specifically in that book, which is a part of this conversation where some people will say with the native question, well, based on fossil evidence, ginkgos were native everywhere. Mm-hmm. And so, is that not a native plant? And he says, well, yes, but they've been absent for 7 million years, and all of the insects that adapted to live with ginkgos are now in Asia, and they're not here. So if you put a ginkgo in your landscape, it's not harmful, but it's not a host for the caterpillars. Maybe enough time will pass, and it will become useful again. I love ginkgo. I'm not saying not to plant them. He's citing that line between usefulness and something being just sort of maybe static,
benign, or whatever.
It's benign, yeah. And ginkgos are incredible, and we're living in a built environment, and so we want to create things that satisfy our needs in that built environment and also give back to nature. I'm beating a dead horse here, but it's a matter of trying to give people permission to garden for different reasons and all the reasons.
I think it's a really good conversation because there are, it's a continuum, right? And you're never going to create what was there 300 years ago. I just think that, first of all, we don't know in most cases what was there, right? And it's an artificial environment no matter what, your lawn. Now, you can cut down all your trees and have a lawn like some of my neighbors do. But that's the extreme. Right?
Well, that's not checking off any of those boxes.
Right, exactly.
It's not good for aesthetics or ecology.
I'm not giving anybody, I don't think anybody should feel good about that if they really want to encourage biodiversity. But there's a lot of in between.
Yeah, and sometimes we haven't talked about this at all, but deer pressure is an interesting part of this whole conversation. The bane of every gardener's existence, but there's an instance where you have a population that's out of balance, right? Like, so there's not enough predators, and here's a prey that has not been checked. And because of that, deer demolish our gardens. But ironically, they have adapted with our indigenous plants, and often our indigenous plants are hammered first when we're creating a cultivated garden. So if you're looking for species diversity, sometimes you have to lean into some introductions just to, if you're not constantly spraying or fencing, to have a landscape in tandem with the deer pressure.
I mean, not to go too deeply down the geek hole here, but I think that's definitely true with woody plants, but with perennials, I just made a list of my favorite native perennials, and most of them are fairly deer resistant. Whereas on the other side, when you're looking at trees and shrubs, it's just the opposite, I think, because they're not going to probably eat that barberry or that burning bush, and those are bad plants.
No, you look at the woodland and you can see the browse line, and there's nothing except for invasive species up into their reach. It's just one more challenge, which is why we don't want to create prohibitively small lists for people and give people too many obstacles. We're at the very core of it all is how do we make impassioned, successful gardeners? How do we be those ourselves, and how do we get more plants thriving in the ground?
And we're learning all the time.
Yeah.
Okay, so overview. Natives, wonderful. Nativars are also wonderful, as long as they're melding in. And well-behaved introductions that coexist and everybody plays nicely together. A combination of this is perfectly acceptable in a couple of non-useful demonstration plants, like Tim's koa. Is yours?
Well, I mean, I also think about this, if you buy a house and it's got a certain portfolio of plants, you're not going to go in and chop everything down that's not native. You might pull out all the barberries, but you may leave other plants that are benign, right? And again, that's a lot of times people aren't starting from scratch. I just tell people incorporate natives into your landscape.
Absolutely.
Just make sure you have a certain percentage of them. So we always ask what you're hopeful about. And I think this has been a hopeful conversation in terms of what people can do and that they can make their environment beautiful and not have huge guilt. But tell us, when somebody comes into your nursery or when you're thinking about selling plants, what's your hopefulness?
I am hopeful that people find a plant that inspires them or a plant community that inspires them, and that they go into gardening with an open mind. This is for a new gardener, obviously. And for seasoned gardeners, I'm just hoping that they come to our nursery and find something new and exciting that they haven't seen before.
Oh, that's definitely going to happen, I can tell you.
Yeah, I would echo that. I hope that people new and experienced will have success, right? They'll put something in that will just thrive, and they'll have an experience watching that plant go through its cycles and seeing how it impacts the environment around it. And I guess that connectivity that we feel as gardeners, that never gets old. And if it's a new experience for someone, it'll create lifelong passion in them. That's why I love this, and I want other people to feel that also.
The more people are connected, the more they're actually going to educate themselves and be thoughtful gardeners, and they be stewards of their land.
Yeah, and the more you know, the more you see.
Yeah.
And it's contagious.
Yeah.
And on that note, thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much for being here. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having us.
That concludes another episode of Nature Calls, Conversations from the Hudson Valley. We would like to thank Sandra Linnell and Devin Connolly from Cornell Cooperative Extension of Columbia and Greene Counties for production support. And a special thank you to our listeners for joining us on this episode of Nature Calls, Conversations from the Hudson Valley. You can find links to any of the topics mentioned in this episode at our website at ccecolumbiagreen.org. Comments and suggestions for future topics may be directed to us at columbiagreenmgb@cornell.edu or on the CCE Master Gardener Volunteers of Columbia and Greene Counties Facebook page. For more information about Cornell Cooperative Extension of Columbia and Greene Counties, visit our website at ccecolumbiagreen.org or visit us in Hudson or in Acra. Cornell Cooperative Extension provides equal programming and employment opportunities